U.S. Senator and presidential candidate for 2016. Senator Ted Cruz, welcome back to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great, Chad. It's always great to be with you.
Well, I appreciate your time today. And how is the campaign trail?
You know, it is fantastic. Heidi and I have been on the road nonstop, and the energy and excitement we are seeing is off the charts. You know, you'll recall in the Senate race in Texas, the kind of grassroots passion that it built slowly through the campaign, but as the election got closer and closer, there was just an energy from the ground. It was Republican women, it was young people, it was Hispanics, it was small business owners, it was Tea Party leaders, it was the grassroots. Chad, we're seeing that same thing coming together in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina. It's incredibly encouraging. And I think the only way we're going to turn the country around is if the grassroots rise up and hold all our elected officials accountable. It will not come from Washington. Washington is profoundly broken. I have seen it firsthand. But I am so optimistic because I think people are waking up. The worse things get, the more people are waking up, and that's what it's going to take to turn things around.
You know, Senator, I remember having you on my show when you were in the early days of your Senate campaign, and there were a lot of folks out there who gave you absolutely no shot at beating David Dewhurst for on the Republican side, and there were people who said, "Oh, this Ted Cruz, who's Ted Cruz?" But you're right, you built up that grassroots support. The more you went to town halls, the more you went on talk radio, the more people heard your message, and that message resonated with those folks. Is that grassroots support, is that as instrumental in your race right now for president as it was back in that race for Senate?
Absolutely. It is the entire core of the campaign. You know, I'll give you one example, which is a couple of weeks ago, all the campaigns filed their fundraising reports. Now, of the 16 Republicans who are running, do you know which campaign raised the most hard money for the campaign?
That would be you.
That would be us. We raised $14.3 million. In second place was Jeb Bush with $11.4 million. Now, if I'd have told you 3 months ago that we were going to outraise every Republican candidate in the field, including outraising Jeb Bush by $3 million, you would have said I was barking at the moon crazy.
Are you kidding me? Everyone was predicting that, right?
Well, and let me tell you why, Chad, because it really underscores your question about the grassroots. The $14.3 million we raised came from over 175,000 contributions in all 50 states, all 5 territories. The average contribution was $81. It was people all over the country who came to tedcruz.org. Tedcruz.org contributed. Do you know we have had contributors from roughly half of the zip codes in America? 48.1% of zip codes in America have one or more Cruz campaign donors who've come to tedcruz.org. That is the power of the grassroots, and it is the only thing strong enough to break the Washington cartel, to change the bipartisan corruption right now that has resulted in an $18 trillion debt that is bankrupting our kids and grandkids.
We are visiting with Senator Ted Cruz, Republican presidential candidate. You brought up the Washington cartel, and this is something, if people have been paying attention to the campaign, you have spoke often about the Washington cartel.
Yes.
You made numerous references to it. Let me ask you this question, and I'm sure this is a question that many are wondering. When you mention Washington cartel, that makes, I think, a lot of voters seem like, oh my goodness, this is almost impossible to break through in Washington, D.C. How would President Cruz break through the Washington cartel to really put America back on the right track?
Well, Chad, it is a great question. You know, as you know, I have a new book that came out a few weeks ago called A Time for Truth. And my new book, what it does is it takes readers behind closed doors in the United States Senate. If you ever wondered what happens in a Republican Senate conference lunch, why is it that Republican leadership seems to constantly cut deals with the Democrats and sell out the conservative principles that they campaign on and they get them elected. Well, my new book, A Time for Truth, shines the light on what's happening, and it tells the inside story of what I call the Washington cartel. What is the Washington cartel? It is career politicians in both parties who get in bed with lobbyists and special interests, and they grow and grow and grow government, and they stop listening to the men and women who elected them. And it is a growing problem. The book, A Time for Truth, highlights the role of money in Washington and how it's corrupting our elected officials. Now, you ask, how do we change that? Well, there are two steps. There's number one, the election, and then number two, an office. On the election, we have an example in our lifetimes. In 1980, Ronald Reagan took on the Washington cartel. All of Washington despised Ronald Reagan, and he built a grassroots tidal wave that became the Reagan Revolution. It came from the American people, and it transformed this country. It brought us from economic stagnation to booming economic growth. It brought us from weak and feckless foreign policy to winning the Cold War. The only way to win is, I believe, 2016 will be an election like 1980, and that we will win, as Reagan said, by painting in bold colors and not pale pastels. Now, the second part of your question, you said, okay, if you win, how do you change it? If I'm elected president, number one, I will make abundantly clear to Republican leadership, if you keep passing corporate welfare and cronyism and pork, I will veto it. As president, one president can veto and stop the corruption by standing up. But in addition to that, as president, I will lead vigorously with Congress to address the real priorities of the American people, to bring back jobs and economic growth and opportunity. And you do that, number one, by repealing Obamacare. And I will fight tooth and nail in Congress for us to finally honor the commitments to repeal every word of Obamacare and to pass fundamental tax reform, ideally adopting a simple flat tax where every American can fill out his or her taxes on a postcard, and we can abolish the IRS. Now, more broadly, Chad, a president can do a great deal on both foreign policy and on regulatory reform in the executive branch, even without Congress standing up and leading. A president has a great deal of authority. Foreign policy can change overnight. It's worth remembering, Iran in 1981 released our hostages the day Ronald Reagan was sworn in. That's the difference a strong commander-in-chief can make. And on regulatory reform, we have never seen a president willing to use the full Article II authority of the Constitution and the presidency to take on the regulatory state, to take on the EPA and the CFPB and OSHA and all of the federal regulators that descend like locusts on small businesses and destroy jobs. Under Democrats, regulations grow exponentially. Under Republicans, sadly, they grow more slowly. I give you my word, if I am elected president, when I leave office, the body of federal regulations will be materially smaller, and human liberty, the liberty of each of us, will be an equal amount larger as a result.
Visiting with Senator Ted Cruz, Republican presidential candidate. Earlier you brought up leadership, Republican leadership. Let's say that the House, the Senate stays Republican past the 2016 election. You have the same leadership that you have right now, but President Cruz is in the White House. Do you think that the current leadership wants to work with President Cruz?
Of course not, but they will. The current leadership, we just have had a big battle this past week in the Senate. It's a battle where leadership and I have been going head to head, and leadership is furious because I've called them out. Because what we have right now, Republican leadership, let's step back for a minute. We as voters, we were told, if only we have a Republican House of Representatives, then things will be different. In 2010, millions of us rose up, and we elected a Republican House of Representatives, and very little changed. Then we were told the problem is the Senate. If only we get rid of Harry Reid, then finally we will do something.
Right.
So in 2014, millions of us rose up, threw out 9 Senate Democrats, elected a Republican majority, retired Harry Reid as majority leader. And what the heck has happened? What has the Republican majority done? The first thing we did is Republican leadership joined with Harry Reid in passing a $1 trillion omnibus bill filled with corporate welfare and pork. Then the Republican majority voted to fund Obamacare, voted to fund President Obama's unconstitutional executive amnesty, voted to fund Planned Parenthood, and then Republican leadership jammed through the nomination of Loretta Lynch as Attorney General. Chad, every single one of those is identical to what would have happened under Harry Reid and the Democrats, and it's why people are so frustrated. What we have right now in Washington is what I call the McConnell-Reid leadership team. They're not fighting for separate priorities or a separate party. They're both fighting for the party of Washington. Now, how does that change? It changes the exact same way it did under Reagan. When Reagan got elected, it was with the tidal wave of the Reagan Revolution, and that changed the incentives of elected officials in Washington. Listen, Reagan transformed this country with Tip O'Neill, a Democrat, as Speaker of the House, but Tip O'Neill wanted to keep his job, and he knew he couldn't stand up to the American people when they rose up with a mandate from the election. The same thing is true in Washington, that our leadership isn't listening to us, but if we come out of the election with a sufficient mandate, with a president who stands with the people, then leadership will listen to the people as well, but not voluntarily.
Senator, I have 2 more questions. I know you're short on time, but I have 2 more questions for you, if you don't mind. And one of them dealing with Iran and the Iranian agreement that is out there. Obviously, you were against this. Yesterday, you reiterated that for President Obama and his role in this is that he would be basically the world's leading financier of radical Islamic terrorism. This morning, Mitt Romney came out and said that language was over the line, that was too far, and it hurts the cause. Your response to not only to what Mitt Romney tweeted, but also just to the Iranian agreement, how President Cruz would handle Iran going forward.
Well, sure. First of all, let me say that this Iranian nuclear deal is catastrophic. It poses the gravest national security threat to this country of anything we are facing. Why? For several reasons. One, if it goes through, hundreds of billions of dollars will flow to Iran that they will use to fund radical Islamic terrorism to murder Americans. 2, because it leaves 4 American hostages languishing in Iran. The last president to leave hostages in Iran, Jimmy Carter, that weakness and appeasement profoundly weakened America. But 3, this deal accelerates Iran's acquiring nuclear weapons, and they have pledged to use those nuclear weapons. The Ayatollah Khamenei routinely leads chants of death to America. And if history teaches anything, it is that when somebody tells you they want to kill you, you should believe them. Now, it's interesting. In the past couple of weeks, we've seen both Mitt Romney and Jeb Bush, both of them talking about now. Take it easy, guys. You don't really need to oppose this Iranian nuclear deal quite so forcefully. It's interesting. 2 days ago or 3 days ago, President Obama was in Africa, and he chose to attack me directly for saying that if this deal goes through, the Obama administration will become the leading global financier of radical Islamic terrorism. And he attacked me personally, but you know what he didn't do? He didn't disagree with the facts. Here are the facts. Iran is today the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2, if this deal goes through, over $100 billion in American control will flow to Iran. Fact number 3, we know to an absolute certainty a substantial portion of that over $100 billion will be given to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to radical Islamic terrorists. And as a result, those billions of dollars in American control will be used by jihadists to murder Americans, to murder Israelis, to murder Europeans. Those are the facts. The unavoidable consequence of those facts is if this deal goes through, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry will be the leading global financiers of radical Islamic terrorism on the face of the earth. Now, when Barack Obama attacked me in Africa for saying that, he didn't point to any other entity that would be a larger financier of radical Islamic terrorism. When you send billions of dollars to jihadists trying to kill Americans, you bear responsibility for the murder that they carry out with the money you have given them. And, one of the reasons Republicans keep getting clobbered it is we have leaders like Mitt Romney and like Jeb Bush who are afraid to say that. Now, it's not a question of rhetoric. So Mitt Romney's tweet today said, gosh, this rhetoric is not helpful. John Adams famously said, facts are stubborn things. Describing the actual facts is not using rhetoric. It is called speaking the truth. Part of the reason Mitt Romney got clobbered by Barack Obama is because we all remember that third debate where Barack Obama turned to Mitt and said, I said the Benghazi attack was terrorism, and no one is more upset by Benghazi than I am. And Mitt, I guess listening to his own advice, said, well, gosh, I don't want to use any rhetoric, so okay, never mind. I'll just kind of rearrange the pencil on the podium here. We need to stand up and speak the truth with a smile. But we need, the truth has power, and every time we have Republicans who shy away, who don't want to engage, who don't want to speak the truth, we lose. In 1979 and 1980, when Ronald Reagan said, the Soviet Union is an evil empire, it will end up on the ash heap of history, all of the voices, all of the moderate Republicans who were scared, all of the establishment Republicans, they said, ooh, that rhetoric is not helpful. Speaking the truth is the only way you actually prevail. As Margaret Thatcher said, first you win the argument, then you win the vote. Likewise, I thought it was really unfortunate in the past couple of weeks to see Jeb Bush, number one, attacking Mike Huckabee for speaking out about the incredible threat a nuclear Iran poses to Israel. In this, I agree with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Mike Huckabee both. Prime Minister Netanyahu said a nuclear Iran poses an existential threat to Israel, and I'm sorry, Jeb Bush is wrong. We shouldn't shy away from saying that. Likewise, I disagreed with Jeb Bush when he said, well, it's not reasonable for the next president to say he will cancel this agreement when he enters office. It is absolutely reasonable for any serious commander-in-chief to say that he will abrogate any deal that undermines U.S. national security. And I recognize that the foreign policy establishment in Washington don't want to see that happen. They'd rather a horrible deal that endangers national security than actually a commander-in-chief who defends this nation. But I'll tell you this, Chad, I will never shy away from speaking the truth about the threats that face this country and about the steps we need to take to ensure that we keep every American safe and secure.
Senator Ted Cruz, as always, appreciate your time this morning, and we hope to visit with you throughout your campaign here on the show.
Thank you, my friend, and once again, I'd encourage everyone to please come to tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org. Support us, volunteer, contribute, stand with us. This is a movement from the people, and if we're ready to turn things around, it's got to come from each and every one of us. That is the strength and power and how we bring back the principles that have made America great.
Republican presidential candidate and U.S. Senator from the state of Texas, Ted Cruz, here on the Chad Hasty Show. Thank you, sir, very much.